While others missed the moment, these leaders saw the signal and made the bet. In this episode, Brett Shockley, the CEO of Journey, reveals the bold bet that redefined how contact centers authenticate callers and eradicate fraud. Welcome to This Way Forward with Charlie Newark-French. My guest today is Brett Shockley, the CEO at Journey. Journey has reinvented how customers are authenticated when they're communicating with the businesses of their choice. Brett, thank you for joining us. You know the format here. This is a 10-minute discussion, roughly, all centered around the big strategic bet you made. If you're up for it, let's dive in.
All right, let's do it. Thanks for having me, Charlie.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
So I'll let you choose the bet. What are we speaking about? What's the big strategic bet you made at Journey?
Well, I thought that today we might just talk a little bit about the idea of starting the company in the first place. The reality is that we saw some very big issues in the customer journey associated in particular with contact centers, but really any way that you interact with a company. And I would say that our observations about what needed to be fixed weren't necessarily obvious to everyone else on day one, although they've proven to become very obvious over time. Mm-hmm. The thought process, I come out of the contact center background, Cisco, Avaya, and several startups. My son comes out of the digital marketing arena where he built and sold a digital marketing company. And we got to talking about how do you reinvent the customer journey in a way that's very meaningful. And our theory was that if you wanted to really change the way things worked, you needed to address both the identity of the customer as well as addressing the security of the interaction. Because the more you know about someone, the more data you have about them, the riskier that data becomes. And so thinking about new ways to leverage that, but doing it in a safe and sane way became important. So what we ended up doing was deciding that we needed to look at the customer journey through the eyes of the customer. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it from that perspective, as opposed to a bunch of individual product silos, you sort of had this first step where you're enrolling or verifying the identity of someone. Then you're authenticating them across channels over time and across geographies. Now you're starting to be able to be in a position to have a streamlined experience of doing transactions and interactions with that customer. But now you're tying all that identity data, which is PII, PFI, PHI, sensitive and regulated data, together with the transactions you're doing, which might be a payment, which might be a healthcare interaction of some kind, might be signing documents or making contracts. And so you sort of have these two competing things happening, where on the one hand, we're going to know a lot more about you. We're going to know who you are with a high degree of veracity. But on the other hand, we're going to have all this data that gets complicated from a compliance and risk perspective. And so, but we decided that if we could solve that problem, we could dramatically change the nature of customer journeys and address the user experience of the customer, the operational efficiency of the business, and deal with all the fraud and data privacy and security issues. And so that was sort of the whole big hairy problem that we started with. And jumping into it, the world sort of already had a way they did these things and didn't necessarily realize back in those days that they needed to solve this problem, although that world has changed over the last few years.
So part of your big strategic bet here, Brett, sounds like it was starting with the customer journey. What does the opposite of a good customer journey look like, and what were you trying to create for the customer journey?
Well, let's think about what happens when you call a typical contact center today, or you, whether you're talking to a human being or the IVR or agentic AI even. Typically what happens is you're calling in, and the first thing they're going to do is they're going to want to know who you are and authenticate you. Oftentimes that's your mother's maiden name, what's your favorite pizza topping. If they want to go more in depth, maybe it's what house did you live in 5 years ago. It's a lengthy experience. It takes on average 45 to 90 seconds. And in some companies, it can take up to 5 minutes to really do a solid job of identifying someone. Customer hates it. Operations hates it. At $1.50, $2 a minute, it's a very expensive proposition for the business. So assuming you've gotten through all that now, you're already slightly annoyed. Then the contact center starts to ask you questions that make you squirm. They start to ask you questions about, what's your social security number? What's your birth date? What's the account number that you're calling about? What's your credit card number? All these things tend to make you squirm because you're assuming that the person you're talking to is probably working from home these days,
Yeah.
and they very well could be working offshore somewhere. And what's to stop them from writing down all that information and having all of your information stolen, which is, of course, what we hear about every day.
Right. So you've started that interaction before you've even started speaking to the business, quote unquote, you want to speak to, frustrated, a little worried, and confused, I'm guessing, as the normal route.
Exactly. And it doesn't get better from there.
Yeah.
So what, being a millennial with a different point of view on things, my son's sort of first perspective was coming from the user experience point of view. Hey, everybody that's calling this call center is calling from a smartphone. If they're calling from a smartphone, there's a whole bunch of things on that besides the speaker and the microphone. There's cameras, there's sensors, there's all kinds of things that you could use to create a multimodal experience that would be much richer and create a much better and faster user experience. So that was sort of one side of the development theory that we started working on. And the other was we needed a different security model. We didn't want the agent or the agentic AI, for example, to hear or see a bunch of information that it didn't really need. So, for example, if an agent were to ask you your social security number, they really don't need to know what your social security number is. They just need to know that you verified it successfully.
Mm-hmm.
And so by bringing the smartphone into play and creating a multimodal conversation, we now have a scenario where either the human agent or an agentic AI solution, when it gets to that sensitive data, can basically send the request to the customer on their smartphone. Customer can enter the data on their smartphone. It's locally and ephemerally encrypted there for wherever it does have to go, the back end of a bank, the DMV, a regulator, maybe multiple places. It can get verified there and sent back to the agent or the AI only what it needs to know. So yes, the social security number was validated. This person lives in Colorado, but not their street address. They're over 21, so they can buy alcohol, but not their birth date. And if you think about it that way, you now have the ability to create, on the one hand, very personalized experiences that are very efficient, but do it in a way where you're not providing all this sensitive and oftentimes regulated data to the agent or to the AI. And when you start thinking about everything from payments to healthcare conversations to any kind of interaction that you're having with a business, they tend to take a long time. They're not very effective, and there's huge risk of data leakage.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, you started by using this phrase non-obvious, I think. You're a long way ahead at the moment. I don't know anyone else that's doing what you're doing to the extent you're doing it. Why aren't others following? What differentiates you at this point? How are you so far ahead? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. If you take a look at sort of the state of the market today, what you'll find is a set of competitors for sort of each step in this customer journey. Yep. And they tend to view their world as competing around that particular action. So there's multiple companies that do identity verification, for example. There's companies that do authentication. There's people that will do document signing. There's other competitors that will do data collection on the smartphone. But they're thinking about it in terms of competing within that category. And then if you go and you look at deploying this into any kind of a enterprise sort of solution, what ends up happening is the CIOs that I talk to tell me that when they do that, they better be ready to embark on a multi-year journey to integrate each one of those technologies across the journey. Typically, they're going to have different user experiences, and they're going to have security holes that they're going to fight with at each point where you shift from one technology to another. So this idea of doing it through the eyes of the customer and thinking about how to streamline that experience from their perspective is sort of a unique way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. And what we did from a technology point of view, that was the other big key to what we've done here, is we really went back and did some very fundamental thinking, and we took the concept of zero-knowledge cryptography, which has been popularized in the cryptocurrency world, and we expanded that into a network concept that we call a zero-knowledge network. And it deals with this ability to deal with the data in a highly secure, privacy-preserving manner. In fact, we never actually have a database of customer data. We actually don't have the keys to unencrypt data in flight that's being moved around as part of these transactions. We're merely orchestrating it. And so, when we talk to CISOs, my fear when I first started the company was that we were going to run into a situation where they would say, "What's this new data model you have? That's not what we're used to." And once they understand what we're doing with this zero knowledge network, the typical answer we get from pretty much every CISO we've ever talked to is, this is the way everybody should do it in the future. Because if you don't have the data,
Yeah.
you've destroyed the hacker economics. There's really nothing to nothing to steal.
Yeah. One of the questions I like to ask people, Brett, is what stood in your way? So you were a startup when you did this, right? You were just beginning. You came up with this idea. Your idea was, let's start with the user journey. Let's start with the smartphone and the device they've got it in hand. Who did you have to persuade as you thought about executing on that strategy?
So, it was very interesting because very early on, as we would show demos to customers, the reaction we would get is, "This is amazing. I want this personally. I don't want to ever call a call center in the future that doesn't have this technology." And then the next point would be, "But it's not in my budget because I didn't know this was possible." And so, you end up with kind of a classic crossing the chasm scenario, where you've got to get yourself into, the awareness has to be there. It has to start showing up in the budgets and the RFPs and things like that. The other thing is that, you've got the classic new technology chicken and egg thing. This sounds great, but show me some proof. And, we reached pretty far into the future with a pretty big bet with the scope and depth of what we can do. And so it took a while to kind of get to that point. We got the analysts on board. The analysts all love it. They're all starting to talk about it. You'll hear more about that over the coming months here. But once we started to get some large enterprise customers that had actual data that validated what we're talking about, then all of a sudden the world started to change. So, for example, one of the largest entertainment providers in the world, we took over all of their payment processes in their contact center as sort of the first use case of many that we're working on. And in the case of payments, the way they were doing it before, it took about 4.5 minutes to take a payment from a customer, basically take an order from a customer. And we went in and we said, okay, first off, an order is different than just the payment. The payment's a very narrow piece of it. Typically, when there's a payment, there's also a terms and conditions document to sign. There's typically a, here's what you're going to buy. Do you agree to that kind of thing? And so to us, instead of just thinking payments, with this methodology we have, we can basically send you, here's what you're going to buy, here's the terms and conditions, sign with your finger, and make a payment using the digital wallet on your phone, for example. Well, we were able to take that 4.5 minutes down significantly. Our customer thought that, well, most customers are used to doing payments verbally over the phone, so they're not going to want to do this multimodal thing you're telling me about. So we think, maybe that'll be less than 20% of the people will use the smartphone. The reality is that 97% of the people are using the smartphone. And this is across 8,000 agents. And it's taking, instead of 4.5 minutes, it's taking 49 seconds. So as you start to develop those kind of data that are, frankly, in the contact center industry, a little bit mind-boggling. Everybody talks about saving time, and they're a hero if they can save 5 or 10 seconds. Saving 3 minutes or 4 minutes of handle time is just unheard of, and it's worth millions of dollars. So now that we're starting to get that kind of data, it's much, much easier to get people to move because they can see a return within the year. So that unlocks funds faster. And then you marry that with all the hard work in getting the analysts on board and understanding it, and you start to get to the point where you're starting to be part of what people are asking for, instead of having to sort of sell them on something new that they've never heard of before.
Yeah, got it. Okay, look, you took a very customer-centric approach. Basically, your product needs to be start with the end user in mind and what their journey is, which is entirely different to how everyone else was thinking about it. They were thinking about it as, what's the data I need to collect to protect the business, and you sort of flip that on its head. And then in terms of persuading people, which, by the way, you had to persuade investors, you had to persuade new employees to join your company, you had to persuade analysts that this was actually going to take off. You started with your customers, not the end users. Their end users are their customers, but the customers are like, what's valuable to them? I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and I think growing up in the contact center industry, one of the things that you always find that's interesting is you have the technology companies that are focused on whatever they're going to sell to the call center, and oftentimes they really aren't call center operators, and you see the people that have contact center operations in mind, where a part of their process is to go sit in the contact center and watch what happens, listen to calls, take the agent or the supervisor training classes. And when you do that, all of a sudden you find all kinds of opportunity. So for example, with this company that I was talking about with the payments, the first use case was narrowly payments. But when we went out and sat in their call center at one of their outsourcers and actually watched what was going on, we very quickly realized that prior to the payment, they were spending 2 minutes reading the legal T's and C's that the customer had to agree to on a recorded line, for example. Well, in our case, we said, how about if we just push that to their smartphone ahead of the payment? They'll scroll with their finger, they'll sign like this. It'll take 15 seconds instead of 2 minutes to read it, and we'll save all that time. And of course, the answer is, gee, I never thought of that. So, there's a lot of value when you're creating these products to also spend time actually looking at what's happening, boots on the ground, the headphones on, listening to those calls and sort of figuring out where are the things that suck up all the time that obviously everybody gets upset about because they know they're wasting time, right? And look for ways to optimize those things with a product as opposed to a, custom developed professional service.
Yep. Brett, this is awesome. We are up on time. This is exactly the kind of insight we're looking to hear. Your big bet was really starting with the user in mind for building the product. And then when it came to building the company, starting with the actual buyer, the customer in mind. Very cool stuff. Thank you for making the time today. Very good to see you, Brett.
Thanks so much, Charlie.